Hello. This is a battle of two Johns, Diefenbaker, Kennedy, and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy broadcast a special message to the nation from his office in the White House. Here is President Kennedy as he delivered that message, bearing on recent events in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The world was on the brink of nuclear destruction. Beginning in 1962, the USSR began building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, less than 500 miles off the coast of Florida. On October 15th, a U.S. spy plane spotted these missile sites, which were intended to be fit with nuclear warheads. President John F. Kennedy swiftly organized a naval blockade of Cuba in order to block Russian shipments. Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was informed of the crisis and responded. He wanted more information on Russia's intentions before taking drastic action. He urged Kennedy to consider sending UN inspectors to Cuba to determine the reality of the situation. The U.S. was ready to take drastic action and urged Canada to raise their military alert level to the dreaded DEFCON 3. Diefenbaker was worried that raising the military alert level may provoke the Russians into attacking, leading to the annihilation of the human race. Going behind his back, Diefenbaker's National Defense Minister Douglas Harkness raised the military alert to DEFCON 3 prior to receiving formal approval. Diefenbaker was furious that someone in his government subverted his notedly anti-American stance, but as the USSR moved closer and closer to the US blockade, Diefenbaker formally raised the military alert level on October 24, 1962. 4 days later, on October 28, after a series of negotiations between Russian and American diplomats, the crisis came to a conclusion.
Hello? General, how are you? Oh, fine. General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know of your concern about it. We got, Friday night, got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba.
Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow that the USSR would dismantle the missile sites so long as the Americans promised not to invade Cuba after its botched attempt at supporting a Cuban-American invasion of the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the closest we came during the Cold War to active use of nuclear weapons. This flashpoint of tension between the US and the USSR was also the worst period for Canada-US relations in the history of the two countries' 150-year relationship. Despite how bad things may seem in 2018 between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump and the tensions that have arisen between the two countries, the period surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis trumps our current standings by far. Why were tensions so high at a time where cooperation was so crucial in preventing the threat of nuclear annihilation? Prime Minister John Diefenbaker and President John F. Kennedy were radically different people. Diefenbaker, a lawyer from Saskatchewan, rose to power riding a wave of Canadian nationalism and a growing anti-American sentiment. Diefenbaker was a proud populist and a nationalist, a staunch conservative who aimed at reconnecting Canada with its British roots. Diefenbaker went so far as to claim that he wanted to shift 15% of Canada's trade from the US to the UK. Diefenbaker saw Canada's growing economic dependence on the US and the cornering of the markets by the US as a dangerous threat to what was an independent Canada. Diefenbaker did see the benefits of militarily cooperating with the US and eagerly agreed to join the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, in order to prevent Russian attacks on North America. Diefenbaker captured the hearts and minds of the rural and small-town Canadians, who saw Canada's future as an attempt to one-up the liberal experiment to the south. Diefenbaker, who saw the US as slowly but surely trying to swallow Canada into its empire, believed that Canadian nationalism was essential for Canada to survive American expansionism. Diefenbaker saw the intellectuals as having no place in politics, despising the kind of politicians like Franklin Delano Roosevelt who applied academia to politics. President John F. Kennedy was very much the intellectual type. Born in Massachusetts to a rich and Catholic family, JFK was forced to compete with his siblings from a very young age. A Harvard scholar and a military veteran, by 1946 JFK ran in his first election. In one of the greatest political careers in history, Kennedy, by successfully applying academia to politics, never lost once. Kennedy was known as a senator who was extremely responsive to his constituents, taking interest in both improving American foreign policy and civil rights. Kennedy's run for president highlighted his ability to be extremely charismatic. Kennedy walked the delicate tightrope of religion and politics. When critics claimed that there will never be a Catholic president, Kennedy sidestepped the criticism by reminding everyone how important the separation of church and state is. Kennedy's campaign was thematized by charisma and elitism, as JFK was often seen making his fellow Harvard friends laugh. When he was elected president for the first time in 1960, narrowly beating Republican candidate Richard Nixon, JFK was the youngest and first Catholic president in U.S. history. Aged 65 and 45 respectively at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Diefenbaker and Kennedy clearly were from not only different class backgrounds, but different generations completely. Diefenbaker once said of Kennedy, "He's a hothead, he's a fool, too young, too brash, too inexperienced, and a boastful son of a bitch." For the sake of comparison, Donald Trump is 72 and Justin Trudeau is 46. Clearly, coming from different generations leads to fundamentally different perspectives on the world and how it should be governed. Diefenbaker and Kennedy's fundamental understanding of who should be a politician were radically different. Diefenbaker believed a leader should come from the community, not the university. Kennedy, by contrast, believed that academia produced people most capable of governing effectively, a position which mirrored the position of the Canadian Liberal Party, the importance of which we shall see later. Diefenbaker's contempt towards Kennedy and the Liberals was sourced in his conception of a politician as a working person and not a Columbia or Harvard University elite. This was extremely evident in the policy choices of both Diefenbaker and Kennedy around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, each of which drastically decreased the quality of relations between Canada and the U.S. to the point where Diefenbaker recalled the Canadian ambassador in Washington and the U.S. began interfering with Canadian domestic politics. A large part of the tension that existed between the two countries was the result of a series of policy choices by both governments. A major source of contention was Canada's sale of wheat to China. Canada had been selling wheat to China since before the Second World War. However, the magnitude of the sales increased drastically beginning in 1961. There were three reasons why Canada increased its sales to China. First, Canada harbored doubts about how smart it was to isolate a communist China. Second, there was increasing anger towards the U.S. for stealing Canadian wheat markets elsewhere in the world. Canada's most important exports at the time were paper and wheat, and therefore any cornering of the markets threatened Canada's economy. Finally, Canada was harboring nationalistic tendencies. The Canadian government saw their own national interest as more important than Western solidarity. During the Cold War, Canada's view of Cuba increased and its view of the U.S. decreased. Canada felt a shared identity with Cuba, both of them seeing themselves as an economic satellite of the U.S. Canadians saw the invasion at the Bay of Pigs as a moral failing on behalf of the U.S. and as reflecting the United States' tendency to dominate people with force rather than negotiation. Canada saw Cuba's revolution as less communistic and more nationalistic, reflecting the upswing of nationalism at home on Canadian soil. Canadian Minister of External Affairs Howard Green suggested Canada may have a role to play in easing tensions between the U.S. and Cuba. Going further, Green publicly questioned the U.S. involvement in places where they did not belong, such as Laos and Vietnam. This no doubt infuriated the U.S., who saw Cuba as a betrayer of U.S. interests in favor of communism. Kennedy fell just short of calling Green an idiot in public. Kennedy's behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis was pessimistic, cautious, and skeptical. He had no time for Canada's flirtation with his enemy. A prime example of the tension that arose from policy decisions around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Beaumark Missile Crisis. In the fall of 1958, Diefenbaker announced an agreement with the U.S. to allow American-made Beaumark missiles installed at multiple sites in Canada. This came on the heels of Diefenbaker officially scrapping the Avro CF-105 Arrow. During the 50s, Canada had been developing the Avro Arrow as a way of meeting its air defense requirements. Though it was an engineering marvel, the cost of the Avro Arrow rose drastically with little international interest in purchasing the planes. Diefenbaker was therefore pushed into a position of accepting American-made Beaumark missiles as a substitute for the failed Avro Arrow project. Diefenbaker's decisions angered Canadian nationalists and led to a large number of Canadian engineers heading stateside for work. Worse for Diefenbaker was when the public learned that the Beaumark missiles in North Bay, Ontario and La Macasa, Quebec were going to be armed with live nuclear warheads. This led to a string of counter-protests in Canada from the anti-nuclear advocates, wearing down the confidence the public had in Diefenbaker. Responding to the concerns of Canadians, Diefenbaker refused to accept the nuclear warheads. He backtracked on his earlier position that he would accept the warheads if it was absolutely necessary for North America's defense. He now believed that the nuclear option may no longer be necessary. Diefenbaker wanted to refuse the idea that NATO operates as an instrument for American interest. He wanted to cling to the notion that NATO was an alliance of sovereign nations. Diefenbaker saw Canada's role on the world stage as mediating the interests of its UK roots and the growing American influence on Canadian life. The opposing Liberal Party made it clear that, if in power, they would readily accept President Kennedy's request for arming Canada with American-made nuclear weapons. President Kennedy, too, had made it clear that he was not going to put up with much more nonsense from hesitant and resisting countries. In Diefenbaker's eyes, the Liberals were more than happy to become a tool to be used for the benefit for the American empire. The elites on both sides of the border were getting ready to mount a systematic attack against Diefenbaker, the last beacon of Canadian nationalism. The establishment was trying to steamroll over everything Diefenbaker and therefore Canada stood for. On February 5, 1963, the Canadian House of Commons passed a vote of non-confidence regarding Diefenbaker's government, citing Diefenbaker's failing leadership and his slippery grip on international relations as its fault. According to Diefenbaker and others inside his Conservative Party, the Kennedy administration deliberately assisted the Liberals in their attempt to overthrow the ruling Conservative Party. Diefenbaker believed he had failed in his attempt to prevent the U.S. from determining Canadian defense policy. The Kennedy administration openly intervened in Canada's political debate regarding the presence of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, releasing a note challenging Diefenbaker's position on the issue. Canadian press even took issue with U.S. interference, one paper going so far as calling Kennedy a bully. Diefenbaker responded to the challenge from the Kennedy administration by recalling Charles Ritchie, Canada's ambassador in Washington. Diefenbaker saw the Kennedy's administration's attempts to interfere with domestic politics as interfering with Canada's right to make its own decisions for itself. The pressure put on Diefenbaker's government by the Kennedy administration's challenges to Diefenbaker's positions and the labeling of Diefenbaker as an indecisive leader fragmented the Conservative Party, and the Liberals jumped on the opportunity. Liberal leader Lester B. Pearson's remarks during his movement of non-confidence on February 4, 1963, according to Diefenbaker, mirrored Kennedy's comments and cemented the fact in his mind that the Liberals and the Americans were out to get him. Whether or not the Kennedy administration intentionally destabilized Canada's federal politics, it remains true that the domestic crisis that eventually overtook Diefenbaker's government was caused by American actions. Between Canada's reluctance to accept nuclear warheads, its sales of wheat to communist China, and its growing populism and anti-American sentiments, the Kennedy administration began to see the Diefenbaker government as an extremely annoying and potentially costly pain in the side. In their eyes, they were clearly on the right side of history. Who else was going to stand between tyranny and democracy? The U.S. therefore saw every instance of Canadian political deviation from American demands and expectations as an attack on democracy itself. The Kennedy administration believed that they were morally obligated to protect Canada from the threat posed by the USSR and by proxy themselves. The Kennedy administration therefore did all they could to stoke the nuclear debate in Canada and influence Canadians in the direction of accepting nuclear warheads. Diefenbaker's Conservatives, on the other hand, came to power via the upswing of Canadian nationalism and anti-American sentiments. U.S. interferences in Canadian markets internationally and its morally questionable actions in the fight against communism proliferated a long-standing resentment of the U.S. by Canadians. Seizing the opportunity to define themselves on the world stage as no longer Britain's baby and America's equal, Diefenbaker attempted to distance Canada from the U.S. while trying to mature the relationship Canada continues to hold with the U.K. In 2018, it seems strange to admit that there was a time when Canada wanted a nationalist and populist leader to lead the country in the face of growing populism and nationalism internationally. However, Diefenbaker's nationalism and subsequent anti-American sentiments were arguably well justified, as the US ended up being responsible for disrupting Canada by destabilizing the Conservative government and throwing their support behind the Liberal Party in an effort to fight communism. The rhetoric between the leaders of Canada and the US in 2018 gives the impression that the relations between the countries are at an all-time low. As we have just seen, this is not the case. Things were far worse during the time surrounding the Cold War, and the actions taken were far more drastic than the ones today. Diefenbaker actually recalled the Canadian ambassador from Washington. The Kennedy administration played a direct role in the destabilization of Canada's Conservative government and partisanly interfered with the election that followed the vote of non-confidence in Diefenbaker's government.